The scream tore through the forest before Lyra Ashwood even reached the clearing. She dropped her basket of herbs and ran, her bare feet slapping against wet earth, branches clawing at her arms as she pushed through the trees. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the air itself seemed to hum with danger. The pack bond, faint as it was for someone as low-ranked as her, buzzed with fear. When she broke through the tree line, she saw him. Alpha Kalen Vane stood in the center of the clearing, chest heaving, silver moonlight washing over his broad shoulders. Blood dripped from a gash on his arm. Around him lay 3 of his own warriors, unconscious, and a 4th figure was slowly backing away into the shadows, eyes glowing with a hatred that made Lyra's stomach twist. "Stay back," Kalen growled, not even looking at her, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. But Lyra had never been good at listening to authority. She had spent her whole life being told to stay in the background, to be quiet, to be small. Tonight, something in her refused. The stranger in the shadows lunged. Lyra did not think. She grabbed a fallen branch and swung it with everything she had, catching the attacker across the face just as he closed the distance to Kalen's exposed back. The branch splintered. Pain shot up her arms. The attacker stumbled, snarled, and vanished into the darkness of the trees before anyone could catch him. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the ragged breathing of the wounded warriors and the pounding of Lyra's own heart. Kalen turned to look at her fully for the first time. His eyes, gold and fierce, studied her as if seeing her for the first time, though she had lived in Blackthorn Pack her entire life. She was nobody, a healer's apprentice, a girl who mixed poultices and stitched wounds in the shadow of the pack house, never invited to the gatherings where the important wolves discussed important things. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough. "So could you," Lyra shot back, surprising herself with her own boldness. "You're welcome, by the way." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close. That single night changed everything, though neither of them understood it yet. Word spread through the pack within hours. The healer's apprentice had saved the Alpha's life. Some called her brave, others called her foolish. Lyra did not care what they called her. She only cared that her hands would not stop shaking for a full day afterward, and that every time she closed her eyes, she saw the stranger's glowing eyes and Kalen's blood-soaked arm. 3 days later, the pack gathered for the moon ceremony, the night when the ancestors were honored and mates were sometimes revealed beneath the light of the full moon. Lyra had attended every year of her life, standing at the very back with the other low-ranked wolves, watching the alphas and warriors take their places at the front. This year, something was different. As the moon rose to its highest point and the ceremonial fires crackled, a strange pull settled low in Lyra's chest. It grew stronger with every passing second, an invisible thread tugging her forward, toward the front of the gathering, toward the raised platform where Kalen stood beside the elders. She was not the only one who felt it. She saw the exact moment his head snapped up, his nostrils flaring, his eyes searching the crowd with sudden, desperate intensity. Their eyes met. The world seemed to stop. Every wolf in the clearing felt it too, the shift in the air, the way the fire seemed to burn brighter, the low murmur that swept through the crowd like wind through grass. Mate. The word did not need to be spoken. It hung in the air, undeniable, ancient, written into the very fabric of who they were. Kalen took one step forward, then another. Lyra's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run to him, to close the distance, to complete the bond that thrummed between them like a plucked string. But then she saw the elders exchange glances. She saw the way Elder Corwin's jaw tightened, the way he leaned toward Kalen and whispered something urgent in his ear. She saw Kalen's steps falter. She saw his eyes, so full of wonder a moment ago, cloud over with something else. Doubt, calculation, fear. "No," she whispered to herself, though she was not sure what she was denying. "Not yet. Please. Not yet." Kalen stopped walking. He stood frozen between the elders and the crowd, between duty and desire, and Lyra watched the exact moment he chose. "I reject you," he said. The words landed like physical blows. Lyra felt each syllable strike her chest, felt the pack bond that had just begun to weave itself between them, tear apart with a pain so sharp she nearly collapsed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone behind her murmured in shock. She heard her own name whispered, passed from wolf to wolf like poison. Kalen would not meet her eyes anymore. He stared somewhere past her shoulder, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped beneath his skin. "The pack needs a strong alliance," he continued, his voice steadier now, though Lyra could hear the strain beneath it. "I cannot bond with an unranked healer. I am sorry, but this is my decision as Alpha." The elders nodded in approval. Somewhere near the front, a young woman in fine silver robes smiled, and Lyra recognized her as Seraphine, daughter of the neighboring Redmore Pack's Alpha, a match the elders had been pushing for months. Lyra stood perfectly still. She would not cry. She would not give any of them the satisfaction. Every eye in the clearing was on her now, waiting to see how the rejected healer would react, waiting for her to break down, to beg, to make a scene they could gossip about for years. She did none of those things. She turned, and with a calm she did not feel, she walked out of the clearing, her spine straight, her chin high, even as her chest felt like it had been carved open and left raw beneath the moon. She did not look back. If she had, she might have seen Kalen's hand curl into a fist at his side, his knuckles white, his amber eyes following her retreating figure with an expression that looked nothing like relief. Lyra walked until the sounds of the ceremony faded behind her, until she reached the small cottage at the edge of the Packlands where she lived with her mentor, old Mira the healer. Only then, alone in the darkness of the trees, did she let herself sink to her knees and press both hands over her mouth to muffle the sound that tore its way out of her. The pain of a rejected bond was not something outsiders could understand. It was not simple heartbreak. It was a wound carved into the soul itself, a tearing away of something that had been growing, something that had promised warmth and belonging, and a future she had never even let herself imagine before that night. Now it was gone, ripped out by the very person who should have protected it. Mira found her there an hour later, still curled on the cold ground, shivering though the night was not cold. The old healer did not ask questions. She simply knelt, wrapped her arms around Lyra, and held her, while the younger woman shook apart and slowly, painfully, put herself back together. "He chose wrong," Mira murmured into her hair. "Someday he will understand exactly how wrong." Lyra did not believe her, not that night. That night, she only believed in the hollow ache in her chest and the shame burning through her veins. The following weeks were the hardest of her life. She could not attend a single gathering without feeling the weight of stares and whispers. The pack was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the story of the Alpha's rejected mate spread like wildfire through every corner of Blackthorn territory. Some wolves pitied her, others seemed almost pleased, as if her humiliation confirmed something they had always believed about wolves born without rank or power. Worse than the whispers was seeing Kalen. She could not avoid him entirely. The Packlands were not large enough, and her duties as a healer's apprentice sometimes required her presence at pack gatherings, at the training grounds where warriors were treated for injuries, at council meetings where medical reports were given. Every single time their paths crossed, she felt the same tug low in her chest, the same painful pull of a bond that had been started, but never allowed to finish forming. He never spoke to her directly again. He would look at her sometimes, quick glances he probably thought she did not notice, his expression unreadable, and then he would turn away, as if she were nothing more than a stranger passing through his territory. It was during one of the training ground visits, 3 weeks after the rejection, that Lyra overheard the conversation that changed the course of her life. She had been treating a young warrior's sprained wrist behind a supply tent when she heard Elder Corwin's voice on the other side of the canvas, speaking to Kalen in low, urgent tones. "The Redmore Alliance is not optional," Corwin was saying. "Their territory borders 3 rival packs. Without their support, Blackthorn stands alone against the coalition forming to the north. You know this." "I know," Kalen's voice answered, flat and tired in a way Lyra had never heard from him before. "I made my choice." "Then stop looking like a man who regrets it," Corwin snapped. "Seraphine will be a fine match. Political marriages have built strong packs for generations. Feelings fade. Duty does not. There was a long pause before Kalen spoke again, and when he did, his voice was so quiet, Lyra almost missed it entirely. Some things don't fade, old man. They just get buried. Lyra pressed her hand against her mouth, her eyes stinging with unwanted tears. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, to feel some small satisfaction that he was suffering too. But mostly, she just felt exhausted, and more determined than ever, to build a life far away from Blackthorn Pack. Far away from a man who chose duty over her, every single time it mattered. That night, she made a decision. She found Mira in the cottage's small kitchen, grinding herbs by candlelight, and told the old woman what she had overheard, and what she intended to do. "I'm leaving," Lyra said. "Not tonight, not next week, but soon. There's a healer's guild in the city. They take apprentices from any pack, any rank. I want to go." Mira set down her mortar and pestle, and studied her for a long moment. "You would leave your pack. Your home." "This stopped being my home the night he rejected me in front of everyone," Lyra said, and for the first time in weeks, her voice did not shake. "I can't keep living in a place where every wolf looks at me like I'm something to pity. I want to be somewhere no one knows my name, somewhere I can just be a healer, not the girl the Alpha King threw away." Mira reached across the table and took her hand. "Then I will help you prepare. But know this, child, running from pain does not heal it. Only time and purpose do that." "I know," Lyra whispered. "But I have to try." It took 3 more months for Lyra to complete her preparations. 3 months of quietly learning everything Mira could teach her. 3 months of stockpiling supplies and saving what little coin she earned. 3 months of avoiding Kalen whenever possible, and enduring the pack's whispers whenever it was not. During those months, she watched from a careful distance as the pack prepared for the Alpha's wedding to Seraphine of Redmore. She watched the banners go up in the pack square, watched the visiting wolves arrive from the neighboring territory, watched Kalen stand beside his bride to be at official functions, with an expression carved from stone. She told herself she felt nothing. She told herself the ache in her chest was simply the lingering damage of a broken bond, nothing more, nothing about him specifically. She almost believed it. On the morning she finally left Blackthorn territory, walking down the same dirt road she had walked her entire life with only a single pack on her back, she did not look toward the pack house where the wedding preparations continued. She kept her eyes forward, on the horizon, on the city she had never seen, but had already decided would be her new beginning. She did not know, could not have known, that Kalen stood at his window that same morning, watching her small figure disappear down the road, his hands braced against the windowsill hard enough to crack the wood, his wolf howling with a grief he refused to let anyone see. Nor did she know that the marriage to Seraphine, which would take place in exactly 1 week, was already built on foundations far more rotten than either of them yet understood. Lyra walked until the packlands disappeared behind her, until the trees gave way to open road, until the only sound was her own footsteps and the distant call of birds overhead. She did not cry. She had done enough of that already. Instead, she made herself a promise, one she repeated with every step that carried her further from the life she had known. She would build something new. She would become someone whose worth did not depend on a bond, a rank, or a man's approval. She would become strong enough that no one, not even an Alpha King, could ever make her feel small again. She had no way of knowing how completely that promise would come true, or how many years would pass before fate dragged her back to the one place she swore she would never return to. But that morning, walking away from everything she had ever known, Lyra Ashwood felt something she had not felt in months. She felt free. 5 years passed in the city like water running over stone, slowly wearing away the sharp edges of everything that had once hurt so much. Lyra Ashwood no longer flinched at the memory of a moon ceremony gone wrong. She no longer woke in the night gasping from dreams of golden eyes and a voice saying words that once shattered her. She had built something real for herself in that time, something no one could take away or reject in front of a crowd. Her small shop sat on a quiet corner near the Healers Guild Hall, its windows lined with jars of dried herbs and tinctures, its shelves stocked with remedies she had spent years perfecting. Word of her skill had spread slowly at first, then quickly, until wolves and humans alike traveled from other districts, just to have Lyra Ashwood examine their wounds or mix their medicines. She had earned a reputation built entirely on her own hands, her own mind, her own worth, with no pack rank and no mate bond attached to her name. She liked it that way. On the morning everything changed again, Lyra was grinding willow bark for a fever tonic when the bell above her shop door rang and a young courier stumbled inside, breathless and pale, wearing the deep green colors of Blackthorn Pack. Lyra's hands stilled on the mortar and pestle. She had not seen those colors in 5 years. She had not let herself think about that shade of green in longer than that, though some small, stubborn part of her had never quite stopped noticing when a passing traveler wore something close to it. "Healer Ashwood," the courier said, bowing slightly, his voice tight with urgency. "Forgive the intrusion. I bring an urgent request from Blackthorn Pack." "I no longer serve Blackthorn," Lyra said, her voice carefully even, betraying none of the sudden pounding in her chest. "You have wasted a long journey." "Please," the courier said, and something in his tone made her pause. Not command, not entitlement, but genuine desperation. "Warriors are falling sick. 6 in the past month alone. 2 have already died. Our healers cannot identify the cause, and the pack physician recommended you specifically. He said no one in the region understands rare toxins the way you do." Lyra set down her tools slowly. She thought of the pack she had left behind, the wolves who had whispered about her, the elders who had approved of her humiliation, the man who had rejected her in front of everyone she had ever known. She owed Blackthorn nothing. She had built a life specifically so she would never have to think about that place again. But she also thought about warriors dying from an unknown poison, about young wolves who had nothing to do with the politics of 5 years ago, about the healer's oath she had taken that placed the well-being of the sick above her own personal history. "How many are ill now?" she asked quietly. 4, as of when I left. Perhaps more by the time I return." Lyra closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, her decision was already made, though every instinct in her screamed against it. "I will come," she said, "but understand this. I am coming as a healer, nothing more. I have no ties to that pack beyond the sickness you describe. Once the warriors are well, I will return here, to my own life." The courier nodded eagerly, relief washing over his young face. "Of course, healer, thank you. The Alpha will be most grateful." Lyra's jaw tightened at the mention of the Alpha, but she said nothing. She simply began packing her supplies, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, even as her mind raced through everything returning to Blackthorn would mean. She would see Kaelin again. She would see the pack that had cast judgment on her without a second thought. She would see, perhaps, the wife he had chosen instead of her, the alliance he had valued above whatever had briefly existed between them beneath that full moon. Lyra pressed her palm flat against the counter and took a slow, steadying breath. She was not the same frightened girl who had fled down that dirt road 5 years ago. She was a skilled healer now, respected in her own right, with knowledge that could save lives Blackthorn's own physicians could not. She would walk back into that pack with her head high, treat the sick, and leave again without looking back, exactly as she had the first time. That was the plan, at least. Lyra had learned over the years that plans rarely survived contact with Kaelin Vane. The journey back to Blackthorn territory took 3 days by carriage, 3 days during which Lyra tried and failed to keep her thoughts from drifting toward memories she had worked hard to bury. She thought of the clearing where she had first swung a branch to save a stranger's life, not knowing that stranger would soon break her heart in front of everyone she knew. She thought of the moon ceremony, of the word mate hanging unspoken in the crowded air, of the exact moment hope had turned to devastation. She thought, too, of the years since, of every night she had spent teaching herself that her worth did not depend on any bond, of every success she had earned entirely through her own effort, and she reminded herself that whatever waited for her at Blackthorn, she was not the same woman who had left it. When the carriage finally crested the last hill before Blackthorn territory, Lyra's breath caught despite herself. The packlands looked exactly as she remembered, the same dense forest, the same winding river catching the afternoon light, the same great pack house rising above the trees like it had for generations. And yet everything felt different now, viewed through eyes that had seen the wider world and learned it did not revolve around this single patch of land. The carriage rolled to a stop at the edge of the pack square, and Lyra stepped down, smoothing her travel-worn dress, gathering her medical bag close. A small crowd had already gathered, drawn by curiosity and the news that the healer had finally arrived. She recognized faces in the crowd, older now, some marked by grief she assumed was connected to the sickness the courier had described. A few wolves whispered to each other, their eyes flicking toward her with obvious surprise. She held her chin high and ignored them, exactly as she had trained herself to do. "Healer Ashwood." The voice stopped her cold. She turned, and there he was. Calen Vane stood at the edge of the crowd, and 5 years had changed him too, though not in ways that made him easier to look at. He was still tall, still broad-shouldered, still carrying himself with the natural authority of an alpha king, but there were new lines etched around his eyes now, a weariness that had not been there before, a tension in his shoulders that suggested a man carrying far more weight than any single pack should require. His golden eyes found hers across the square, and for one unguarded moment something raw and desperate flashed across his face before he carefully smoothed it away. "Alpha Vane," Lyra said, her voice cool and professional, the voice she used with difficult patients and demanding clients. "I understand you have a poisoning problem." Something like relief, mixed with something else entirely, crossed his expression. "Thank you for coming. I know I have no right to ask anything of you." "You didn't ask," Lyra said flatly. "Your courier did, on behalf of sick warriors who deserve treatment. I am here for them, Alpha, nothing more." The words landed with quiet precision, and Lyra watched him absorb them, watched the brief flicker of pain cross his features, before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. "Understood," he said. "Please, let me show you to the infirmary. Time may matter." As they walked together across the pack square, Lyra kept careful distance between them, her medical bag clutched tight, her focus deliberately fixed on the pack house ahead, rather than the man beside her. She could feel the old pull in her chest, faint but unmistakable, the ghost of a bond that had never been allowed to fully form, and she hated that 5 years of distance had not erased it completely. She noticed, too, the whispers following them through the square, the way wolves stopped their conversations to stare, the way some expressions held curiosity, while others held something closer to calculation. She noticed, most of all, a woman standing near the pack house entrance, dressed in fine silver robes, similar to the ones Lyra remembered from 5 years before. The woman's eyes tracked their approach with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Lyra's neck rise. Seraphine. The alpha female of Blackthorn Pack watched Lyra Ashwood walk beside her husband, with an expression that gave nothing away, though her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, betrayed a tension that told a very different story. Lyra held the woman's gaze for a brief moment as they passed, offering a polite nod that received nothing in return but a cold, assessing stare. Whatever waited for her inside Blackthorn's walls, Lyra realized with growing unease, this was not going to be the simple, clean visit she had promised herself it would be. The infirmary was worse than she expected. 4 warriors lay in separate cots, their skin an unhealthy shade of gray, their breathing shallow and labored. Lyra moved among them quickly, her professional instincts taking over, examining pupils, checking pulses, noting the pattern of symptoms with the sharp focus that had made her one of the most sought-after healers in the city. This was not a natural illness. She had seen enough poisonings in her years of practice to recognize the signs, the specific way the nervous system failed, the particular discoloration around the lips and fingertips. "This is deliberate," she said finally, straightening from the last cot, her voice grim. "Someone is poisoning your warriors, Alpha Vane. And I intend to find out exactly who." Calen's expression darkened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Are you certain?" "I have seen this compound before," Lyra said. "It takes precise knowledge to create, and precise knowledge to administer without detection. Whoever is responsible knows exactly what they are doing." She looked around the infirmary, at the sick and dying warriors, at the growing shadow of fear that had settled over the pack, and felt her earlier resolve to remain detached beginning to crack under the weight of what she had just discovered. Whatever history existed between her and Kaylin Vane, whatever pain still lingered from a rejection 5 years in the past, she could not walk away from warriors who needed her help. She would find who was responsible for this poison, no matter where the investigation led, no matter whose secrets it exposed along the way. She had no idea yet just how close to home the answer would turn out to be. The infirmary became Lyra's world for the next several days, and she was grateful for the work, grateful for anything that kept her mind occupied and away from the complicated tangle of emotions that being back at Blackthorn had stirred within her. She worked from dawn until well past midnight, testing samples, mixing counteragents, sitting beside the sick warriors as she monitored their responses to each new treatment. Her hands, once shaking with heartbreak in this same territory, now moved with steady, practiced confidence as she fought to save lives that had nothing to do with the pain of her past. The pack physician, an older wolf named Halden, who had trained under Mira decades earlier, worked alongside her, clearly relieved to have someone with deeper knowledge of rare toxins guiding the treatment. "I have never seen anything like this," Halden admitted on the third night, watching as Lyra carefully measured out a new antidote formula by candlelight. The compound changes slightly with each victim, almost as if someone is experimenting. Lyra's hands paused over her work. Experimenting? Adjusting the dosage, perhaps, testing how much a wolf's body can tolerate before it fails completely. Halden shook his head grimly. It is the work of someone with real skill in the poisoner's art. Someone patient, someone who does not want to be caught too quickly. The words settled uneasily in Lyra's chest. A patient poisoner, someone with real skill, someone embedded closely enough within pack life to access warriors without raising suspicion. The possibilities were troubling, and she found herself running through mental lists of everyone she had encountered since arriving at Blackthorn, searching for anyone whose behavior seemed even slightly out of place. She thought again of Seraphine's cold, calculating stare in the pack square, and quickly pushed the thought aside. Suspicion without evidence was dangerous, especially suspicion aimed at the alpha female of the pack she was currently a guest within. She needed proof, not assumptions born from old jealousy she refused to admit she still carried. Kaylin visited the infirmary often during those first days, always checking on the warrior's progress, always keeping careful distance from Lyra herself, as if he understood that any closer proximity would only make things more complicated than they already were. She appreciated the restraint, even as some traitorous corner of her heart noted every time his eyes lingered on her, a moment longer than necessary before he forced himself to look away. It was during one of these visits, late on the fourth night, that Lyra finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been building since her arrival. "Why did you really send for me?" she asked, not looking up from the tincture she was preparing. "Halden clearly has skill of his own. There must have been other healers you could have called, ones with less complicated history attached." The silence stretched long enough that she finally looked up, finding Kaylin standing near the infirmary doorway, his expression torn between honesty and self-preservation. "Because you are the best," he said finally. "And because my warriors are dying, and I refuse to let pride, or the past, cost them their lives when I knew exactly who could save them." "That's a very practical answer," Lyra said, returning her attention to her work, refusing to let the honesty in his voice affect her. "It's the truth," Kaylin said quietly. "Though I won't pretend it was the only reason." Lyra's hands stilled again. She did not ask him to elaborate, and after a long moment, he did not offer to. He simply nodded once, wished her a good night, and left the infirmary, his footsteps echoing down the corridor long after he had gone. Lyra pressed her palms flat against the counter and closed her eyes, breathing slowly until the sudden tightness in her chest eased. She could not afford this. She could not afford to let old feelings resurface, simply because the man who had rejected her was now looking at her with something that resembled regret. She had built an entire life around the promise that she would never again let her worth depend on Kaylin Vane's approval, and she would not undo 5 years of careful healing simply because circumstances had forced them back into the same building. The following morning brought a breakthrough, though not the kind Lyra had hoped for. She was reviewing the blood samples she had collected from each poisoned warrior, cross-referencing symptoms against her extensive knowledge of rare compounds, when she noticed a pattern that made her blood run cold. All 4 poisoned warriors had one thing in common. Each of them had recently been assigned to guard duty near the pack's northern boundary, the same boundary that separated Blackthorn territory from Redmoor lands, Seraphine's birth pack. Lyra sat back slowly, her mind racing through the implications. It could be coincidence. Warriors were rotated through different guard postings regularly, and northern boundary duty was common enough that overlap among victims might mean nothing at all. But combined with Seraphine's cold reception in the pack square, combined with the calculated way the poison's dosage had been adjusted with careful precision, the pattern felt like more than coincidence. She needed more information before making any accusations. An unfounded suspicion against the alpha female could destroy her credibility entirely, and worse, could put her in genuine danger if she was wrong about who was truly responsible. Lyra decided to investigate quietly, carefully, gathering facts before drawing any conclusions. She began by reviewing pack records, official documents Halden granted her access to, under the guise of researching each victim's medical history for treatment purposes. She cross-referenced guard rotations, supply deliveries, and the movements of anyone with access to the pack's food and water stores in the weeks before each poisoning occurred. The picture that slowly emerged was troubling. Seraphine had personally overseen several supply deliveries to the northern boundary posts in recent months, an unusual level of involvement for an alpha female whose duties typically focused on pack diplomacy and internal matters rather than logistics. Lyra also learned, through careful and casual conversations with pack members, who did not realize the significance of what they were sharing, that Seraphine had grown increasingly cold and withdrawn since Lyra's arrival, that whispers about jealousy and suspicion had already begun circulating among the pack's inner circle. None of it was proof. All of it was concerning. On the 5th night since her arrival, Lyra found herself unable to sleep, her mind churning through possibilities as she sat alone in the small guest quarters the pack had provided for her stay. She had just decided to return to the infirmary to check on her patients when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Seraphine standing in the corridor, dressed in a simple dark robe, her expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "Healer Ashwood," Seraphine said, her voice carrying a politeness that felt sharp-edged and deliberate. "I wondered if we might speak, privately." Lyra's instincts prickled with caution, but she stepped aside and allowed the alpha female entry, keeping careful distance as Seraphine moved into the small room and settled into the single chair near the window. "What can I help you with, alpha female?" Lyra asked, remaining standing near the door. Seraphine studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I know why my husband truly sent for you. I am not a foolish woman, whatever you may think of me." "I don't think anything of you," Lyra said carefully. "I came here to treat sick warriors, nothing more." "And yet you've been investigating quite a bit beyond your medical duties," Seraphine said, her tone remaining pleasant even as her words carried clear warning. "Asking questions about guard rotations, about supply deliveries, about me." Lyra kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart had begun to pound. "I investigate anything relevant to identifying the source of the poison. That is my job." "Of course," Seraphine said, standing gracefully and moving toward the door. She paused beside Lyra, close enough that her next words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Be very careful, healer. This pack has secrets far deeper than a rejected mate bond and a broken heart. Some secrets are dangerous to uncover." With that, she swept out of the room, leaving Lyra standing alone, her pulse racing, the warning ringing in her ears like a struck bell. Whatever Seraphine's involvement in the poisonings truly was, one thing had become abundantly clear. The alpha female knew far more than she was willing to admit, and she was fully prepared to defend whatever secrets she was protecting, no matter the cost. Lyra closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing through everything she had learned, and everything she had yet to uncover. She thought of the sick warriors in the infirmary, of the lives still hanging in the balance, and made a silent vow that she would find the truth, regardless of how dangerous that truth might prove to be, or how deeply it might be connected to the very pack that had once broken her heart beneath a full moon. She had not come back to Blackthorn seeking answers about her own past, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the past and the present were far more tangled together than she had ever imagined, and there was no way forward now, except straight through the center of it. Seraphine's warning stayed with Lyra long after the alpha female had left her chambers that night, echoing in her mind through the following days as she continued her work in the infirmary and her quiet investigation alongside it. The warriors were improving, slowly. 2 had regained enough strength to sit up and take small amounts of food. The other 2 remained fragile, but stable, their fevers finally beginning to break under the careful combination of antidotes Lyra had developed. Halden praised her work openly, telling anyone who would listen that the healer from the city had likely saved 4 lives that would otherwise have been lost. Lyra took little comfort in the praise. Her patients were healing, yes, but the person responsible for poisoning them remained free, and every day that passed without answers was another day that person could strike again. She found herself watching Seraphine more closely after their conversation, noting the woman's movements through the pack house, the wolves she spoke with in hushed tones, the careful way she seemed to always know exactly where Lyra was at any given moment. It felt less like coincidence, and more like surveillance, and the realization unsettled Lyra more than she wanted to admit. Kalen, for his part, seemed increasingly distracted and tense as the days wore on. Lyra noticed the way he and Seraphine rarely appeared together anymore, the way their interactions in front of other pack members had grown stiff and formal, stripped of even the polite affection expected of a bonded alpha couple. It confirmed something Lyra had already begun to suspect from the moment she arrived. Whatever existed between Kalen and Seraphine, it was not warmth, and it certainly was not love. Not that it was any of her concern, Lyra reminded herself firmly, more times than she cared to admit. The true break in the investigation came on a rainy afternoon, nearly a week into Lyra's stay, when a young pack member named Finn approached her in the infirmary, glancing nervously over his shoulder before speaking. "Healer Ashwood," he said quietly, "may I speak with you somewhere private?" Lyra led him into the small supply room adjacent to the main infirmary, closing the door behind them. Finn was young, barely out of his training years, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small folded piece of paper. "I work in the supply stores," he explained. "Last week, I found this tucked inside one of the grain shipments meant for the northern boundary posts. I didn't think much of it at first, but after hearing about your investigation, I thought perhaps it might matter." Lyra unfolded the paper carefully. It contained a list of measurements and ingredient names, written in careful, precise handwriting, describing what appeared to be dosage calculations for a compound she immediately recognized from her analysis of the poison. Her pulse quickened. "Where exactly did you find this?" "In a crate, marked for delivery to the northern posts. The crate had come from the kitchen stores, the ones the alpha female personally manages inventory for." Lyra's stomach twisted. It was not conclusive proof, not yet, but it was the strongest piece of evidence she had found so far, and it pointed directly toward the person she had begun to fear was responsible. "Finn, I need you to keep this between us for now," Lyra said carefully. "Can you tell me anything else? Have you noticed anything unusual about the kitchen stores recently?" Finn hesitated, clearly nervous about the weight of what he was about to share. "There's been a new ingredient in the stores the past few months. A rare herb, expensive, imported from outside our territory. I only noticed because I helped unload the shipment personally. The alpha female insisted on overseeing its storage herself, said it was for a special remedy she was developing for the pack's elder wolves." Lyra's mind raced. A rare, expensive imported herb, tightly controlled by Seraphine herself. It could easily be the base ingredient for the poison compound she had been fighting to counteract for the past week. "Thank you, Finn," Lyra said. "You have been incredibly brave coming to me with this. I need you to continue as normal, say nothing to anyone, and if you notice anything else unusual, come find me immediately." Finn nodded, relief evident on his young face now that he had shared his burden, and slipped quietly out of the supply room. Lyra sat alone for several long minutes, staring at the paper in her hands, her mind working through the implications of what she had just learned. She needed more proof before taking this to Kalen, something concrete enough that he could not dismiss it as jealous suspicion or unfounded accusation against his own wife. She decided to examine the kitchen stores herself, under the guise of gathering additional ingredients for her ongoing treatments. That evening, after most of the pack house had settled for the night, Lyra made her way quietly through the kitchen corridors, her medical bag in hand as cover for her true purpose. She found the storage room Finn had described, its shelves lined with carefully labeled jars and containers, most containing common cooking ingredients and herbs. Tucked at the back of the highest shelf, however, she found a small locked cabinet, distinct from the rest of the open storage around it. Lyra examined the lock carefully, her healer's training having given her some knowledge of mechanisms used to secure dangerous medicinal compounds. Using a thin metal probe from her medical kit, she carefully worked the lock until it clicked open. Inside, she found several small vials filled with a pale, unusual colored liquid, along with dried samples of a plant she did not immediately recognize. She withdrew one of the vials carefully and held it up to the dim lantern light, examining the liquid's consistency and color against her memory of the compound she had extracted from the poisoned warrior's blood. Her breath caught. It was an exact match. Footsteps sounded suddenly in the corridor outside, and Lyra's heart lurched into her throat. She quickly returned the vial to its place, closed the cabinet, and turned just as the storage room door opened. Seraphine stood in the doorway, a lantern in her hand, her expression cold and unsurprised, as if she had known exactly where to find Lyra all along. "I did warn you," Seraphine said quietly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "Some secrets are dangerous to uncover, healer." Lyra straightened, refusing to let fear show on her face, though her heart pounded violently against her ribs. "You poisoned your own pack's warriors. Warriors who did nothing but serve loyally under the alpha you claim to have bonded with." "They served under a man who never should have chosen me," Seraphine said, and for the first time, genuine bitterness cracked through her carefully controlled composure. "Do you know what it is like, healer, to be married to a man whose heart belongs entirely to someone else? To feel his wolf mourn every single night for a bond he was forced to reject? I have lived with that shame for 5 years." Lyra felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the small room. "So you poisoned innocent warriors out of jealousy?" "I poisoned warriors from families loyal to factions within this pack, who have questioned my position since the day I arrived," Seraphine corrected coldly. "Factions who whisper that Kaelin should have honored the true bond instead of the political alliance. I was simply removing obstacles, one careful dose at a time, weakening the very families who might one day challenge my place here." The confession hung heavy in the air between them, and Lyra understood with sudden clarity just how dangerous her position had become. She was alone in a locked room with a woman who had just confessed to poisoning multiple pack members, a woman clearly desperate enough to protect her secret that she might resort to far worse, to ensure Lyra never revealed what she now knew. "The pack will learn the truth," Lyra said steadily, refusing to let her voice shake, "one way or another." "Perhaps," Seraphine said, her expression turning calculating, "but that depends entirely on whether you live long enough to tell them." Before Lyra could react, Seraphine moved with sudden, startling speed, reaching for a heavy jar on the nearby shelf, clearly intending to use it as a weapon. Lyra's healer instincts and quick reflexes, honed by years of handling emergencies, kicked in immediately. She grabbed the small stool beside her and shoved it between them, just as Seraphine lunged, creating enough of a barrier to buy herself precious seconds. "Guards!" Lyra shouted, her voice echoing loudly through the quiet corridors of the sleeping pack house. "Someone, please, help!" Seraphine's expression twisted with fury at the interruption, but the sound of approaching footsteps, drawn by Lyra's cry, forced her to abandon her attack. She dropped the jar and straightened her robes hastily, composing her features into something resembling calm, just as the storage room door burst open. Kaelin stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 of his warriors, his eyes darting between Lyra's shaken expression and his wife's suspiciously composed one. "What is happening here?" he demanded, his voice sharp with authority and concern. Lyra took a steadying breath, gathering the last of her courage. "Alpha Vane," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I believe I have found the source of your poisonings, and I am afraid the truth is going to be far more painful than you expect." The Pack Council chamber had not held this many wolves in years. Word had spread within hours that the alpha female stood accused of poisoning her own pack members, and by the time Kaylin called an emergency gathering the following morning, nearly every wolf within Blackthorn territory had crowded into or around the Great Hall, desperate to witness the truth for themselves. Lyra stood near the front of the chamber, flanked by Halden and young Finn, the physical evidence she had gathered laid out carefully on a table before the elders. The locked cabinet's contents, the vials of poison, the dosage calculations Finn had discovered, all of it presented with the same careful precision Lyra brought to every diagnosis she had ever made. Seraphine stood across the chamber, guarded by two warriors, her expression a mask of wounded dignity, even as the evidence against her mounted with each passing minute. "This is absurd," Seraphine said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "A jealous healer returns after years away and suddenly discovers evidence against the alpha female? Ask yourselves who truly benefits from such an accusation." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Lyra felt the weight of dozens of skeptical eyes turning toward her. She had expected this, had known Seraphine would attempt exactly this kind of deflection, and she had prepared accordingly. "I understand the suspicion," Lyra said calmly, addressing the elders and the gathered crowd directly. "I have history with this pack that some of you may find relevant to my credibility. But I did not come here seeking to harm anyone. I came because warriors were dying, and I have spent 5 years building a reputation as a healer, precisely so that my word would mean something when it mattered most." She gestured to the evidence on the table. "The compound found in Seraphine's private cabinet is an exact chemical match to the poison found in every sickened warrior's blood. The dosage calculations found hidden in the supply shipments match the exact measurements needed to produce the symptoms we treated. And Finn, who discovered this evidence, has no history with either myself or the alpha female. He has nothing to gain from lying." Finn stepped forward nervously, confirming his account of finding the paper and the unusual imported herb in the kitchen stores, his young voice trembling but steady as he spoke the truth before the assembled pack. Elder Corwin, older now than Lyra remembered, studied the evidence with a grim expression before turning to Seraphine. "Alpha female, do you deny these findings?" For a long moment, Seraphine said nothing, her carefully composed mask finally beginning to crack under the weight of the assembled evidence and the watching eyes of an entire pack. "I deny nothing," she finally said, her voice hardening with something between defiance and desperation. "I did what was necessary to protect my position in this pack. Do you know what it is like to spend 5 years married to a man who mourns another woman every single night? To feel his wolf reject the very bond meant to unite us, over and over, in silence, while the entire pack whispers behind my back about the true mate he was forced to abandon." Her eyes found Kaylin across the chamber, blazing with years of buried resentment finally spilling into the open. "You never loved me. You never even tried. I was simply a political solution to a problem, and I grew tired of pretending otherwise." Kaylin's expression remained carefully controlled, though Lyra could see the tension radiating through his entire body. "Whatever failures existed in our marriage, Seraphine, nothing excuses poisoning innocent warriors. Nothing excuses attempting to harm the healer who came here to save lives. I did what I had to do to survive in a marriage built on nothing but obligation," Seraphine spat back. "You cannot understand what that does to a person." The chamber fell into tense silence as the elders conferred quietly among themselves, the weight of the decision before them evident in their grim expressions. Finally, Elder Corwin rose to address the gathered pack. "The evidence presented is thorough and compelling," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of law. "Alpha female Seraphine, you stand guilty of poisoning members of this pack, actions that resulted in the deaths of 2 warriors and the near deaths of 4 others. By pack law, such actions cannot go unpunished, regardless of your position or title." A ripple of tension moved through the crowd as the elders pronounced their judgment. Seraphine would be stripped of her title as alpha female, effective immediately, and exiled from Blackthorn territory, forbidden to return under threat of far harsher punishment. As 2 warriors moved to escort her from the chamber, Seraphine cast one final glance toward Kaylin, her expression a complicated mixture of anger, grief, and something that almost resembled relief at finally being free of a marriage that had clearly brought her as much unhappiness as it had ever brought him. I hope you find whatever peace you are searching for, she said quietly, and then she was gone, escorted from the chamber, and, within hours, from the territory entirely. The great hall slowly emptied, as wolves dispersed to process the shocking revelations of the day, whispering among themselves about the fallen alpha female, about the healer who had uncovered her crimes, about what this scandal might mean for Blackthorn Pack's future stability. Lyra remained behind, gathering her evidence materials methodically, grateful for the mundane task that gave her hands something to do, while her mind processed everything that had just unfolded. The poisoner had been caught. Her patients would be safe now. Her work here was, technically, complete. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt strangely hollow, aware that with Seraphine's exile, the primary reason keeping her tethered to Blackthorn had disappeared, and the reality of what came next loomed uncomfortably close. Lyra. She turned to find Kalen standing a few feet away, having waited until the chamber emptied of other wolves before approaching her. His expression carried an exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness, the weariness of a man who had just watched 5 years of his life collapse in a single revelation before an entire audience. You saved lives today, he said quietly. Again. I did my job, Lyra replied, keeping her tone carefully professional, even as her chest tightened with the familiar mix of emotions his presence always seemed to stir within her. You did far more than your job, Kalen said, taking a small step closer. You uncovered a truth I should have seen years ago, in my own home, and you did it while risking your own safety to protect warriors who owe you a debt they can never fully repay. Lyra busied herself with closing her medical bag, avoiding his gaze. The warriors are recovering. That is what matters. I will remain a few more days to ensure their full recovery, and then I will return to my life in the city. Something flickered across Kalen's face at her words, though he said nothing immediately, simply watching her with an intensity that made her skin feel too warm, despite the cool air of the emptied chamber. Lyra, he said finally, his voice lower now, rougher with something that sounded dangerously close to hope. I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know what I did to you 5 years ago cannot simply be forgiven, because circumstances have changed. But please, before you decide anything about leaving, give me the chance to explain everything, to make things right, in whatever way that might still be possible. Lyra finally looked up and met his eyes, finding in them the same raw vulnerability she had glimpsed briefly the night of her arrival, the mask of the confident Alpha King stripped away to reveal the uncertain man beneath. You had 5 years, Kalen, she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. 5 years to explain, to apologize, to reach out in any way at all. You chose silence every single time. I know, he admitted, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of the truth. I was a coward. I told myself distance was kinder, that staying away protected you from further pain I had already caused. I convinced myself of many things that let me avoid facing what I had truly done. Lyra studied him for a long moment, torn between the walls she had spent 5 years carefully constructing and the undeniable pull that still existed between them, weaker now perhaps, but never fully extinguished. I need time to think, she said finally. About everything, about my patience, about what happens next, about whether there is anything left worth discussing between us. Kalen nodded slowly, respecting the boundary she had drawn even as disappointment flickered briefly across his features. Take whatever time you need. I will not push further than you allow. As Lyra walked away from him, out of the great hall, and into the cool evening air, she found herself uncertain, for the first time in years, about exactly what she wanted her future to hold. In the days following Seraphine's exile, Blackthorn Pack settled into an uneasy quiet, the shock of the scandal slowly giving way to relief that the source of the poisonings had finally been identified and removed. Lyra's patients continued their recovery steadily, the 2 remaining warriors regaining enough strength to walk short distances under their own power, their gratitude toward her evident every time she checked on their progress. Lyra found herself lingering in Blackthorn longer than she had originally intended, telling herself it was simply due diligence, ensuring her patients fully recovered before she departed. She did not examine too closely the other reasons that might have kept her feet planted in this territory, rather than already on the road back toward her city life. She saw Kaylin often during those days, though he kept careful distance, seemingly determined to honor his promise not to push her further than she was ready for. She noticed the changes in him more clearly with each passing day, the way he handled pack business with renewed focus, the way he seemed lighter somehow, freed from the weight of a marriage that had clearly brought neither him nor Seraphine any genuine happiness. It was on a quiet afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, that Kaylin finally sought her out properly, finding her sitting alone near the river that wound through the edge of pack territory, the same river she remembered from childhood visits during simpler times. "May I join you?" he asked, keeping respectful distance until she nodded her permission. He settled onto the grass a comfortable distance away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to respect the boundaries she had drawn between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sounds the gentle rush of water over stones and birdsong drifting from the surrounding trees. "I owe you a real explanation," Kaylin finally said, breaking the silence. "Not excuses. An explanation, and an apology that actually means something." Lyra remained quiet, watching the water rather than looking at him, but she did not tell him to stop, so he continued. "When I rejected you that night, I told myself it was for the pack's survival. The elders were not wrong about the threats we faced, about the alliance Redmore could offer against a growing coalition of hostile packs to the north. Every argument they made was logically sound." He paused, his voice growing rougher. "But logic was never truly why I did it. I was afraid." Lyra finally turned to look at him, surprised by the admission. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of failing you," Kaylin admitted, meeting her gaze directly, despite the vulnerability it clearly cost him. "I had just become alpha 6 months before that moon ceremony. I was young, uncertain, terrified of making choices that could cost lives, cost the pack everything my father had built. When I felt the bond form between us, some part of me panicked, convinced myself that a healer's apprentice with no political standing would only make me look weak in front of packs already circling like predators, waiting for any sign of vulnerability. So you chose to hurt me instead," Lyra said quietly, "rather than risk looking weak." "Yes," Kaylin said, the single word heavy with years of buried shame. "And it was the single greatest mistake of my entire life. I told myself for years that I had made the responsible choice, the choice a good alpha should make. But watching my marriage to Seraphine collapse into poison and betrayal, watching how much damage my cowardice caused, not just to you, but to an entire pack I claimed to be protecting, I finally understood the truth. I did not protect anyone that night. I simply protected my own fear." Lyra absorbed his words silently, feeling the old wound in her chest ache with a familiar, but somehow different pain, not fresh anymore, but no less real, for having healed around the edges. "Do you know what the hardest part was?" she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "It wasn't just the rejection itself, it was watching you choose duty in that moment, and then spending years afterward, wondering if I would have made the same choice, if our positions had been reversed. Wondering if what I felt for you was even real, or if I had simply mistaken a biological pull for something deeper." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Kaylin asked softly. Lyra considered the question carefully before answering. "I concluded that it doesn't matter anymore. Whatever existed between us that night was real. I believe that now. But real feelings don't automatically mean a future together. Sometimes the timing is wrong. Sometimes the people involved aren't ready, or capable, of building something healthy together, regardless of how strong the initial pull might be." "Are you saying there's no chance for us?" Kaylin asked, and Lyra could hear the careful control in his voice, the effort it took him not to let desperation bleed into the question. "I'm saying I don't know," Lyra admitted honestly. "I spent 5 years building a life that doesn't depend on you, Kaylin. A life I am proud of. A life that gave me purpose and worth, completely separate from any bond or rejection. I'm not willing to simply set that aside because you've had a change of heart now that your political marriage has fallen apart." The words landed with visible impact, and Kaylin nodded slowly, absorbing the fairness of her point, even as it clearly pained him to hear it. "I understand," he said. "I have no right to expect anything from you. especially not after everything you have already given this pack in the past 2 weeks alone. I only ask that you allow me the chance to prove, over time, that whatever I felt for you 5 years ago was real, and that I am no longer the frightened young alpha who let fear make his choices for him." Lyra studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the ache still lingering in her chest, against the careful walls she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. "I leave in 3 days," she said finally. "My patients are strong enough now that Halden can manage their remaining recovery without me. I have a life waiting for me in the city, patients of my own who need my care, a business I have spent years building." "I understand," Kalen said again, though disappointment was evident in his voice. "But," Lyra continued, surprising herself as much as him, "I am willing to allow correspondence. Letters, nothing more, for now. If you truly wish to prove you have changed, words on paper are a reasonable place to begin, without demanding anything I am not yet ready to give." Something like hope flickered across Kalen's face, carefully restrained, but undeniably present. "I would be grateful for even that much." They sat together by the river for a while longer, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, the changes in the pack over the years, Lyra's life in the city, the small joys and struggles that had filled the years since they had last truly spoken to each other as anything more than strangers passing in a crowded square. It was not reconciliation, not yet, and Lyra was careful to remind herself of that fact as the sun began setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the water. But it was, perhaps, the first honest conversation they had ever truly shared, unburdened by politics, by pack expectations, by the desperate performance of strength that had defined so much of their previous interactions. Whatever came next remained uncertain. But for the first time since arriving back in Blackthorn territory, Lyra found herself cautiously curious about what that uncertain future might hold, rather than solely focused on escaping back to the safety of the life she had built without him. She was not ready to trust him fully. She was not certain she ever would be, but she was, perhaps, willing to see what honesty and patience might build between them, one careful letter at a time. The letters began simply at first, brief and careful, each one testing the boundaries of a fragile new understanding neither Lyra nor Kalen fully trusted yet. Lyra returned to her city life exactly as planned, settling back into the familiar rhythm of her shop, her patience, the quiet independence she had built with such determination over the past 5 years. But now, woven through that familiar rhythm, came something new. Every few weeks a letter would arrive, carried by a Blackthorn courier, sealed with Kalen's personal mark. The early letters spoke of small things, pack matters, the recovery of the warriors she had treated, questions about her work in the city, careful observations about the changing seasons over Blackthorn territory. Lyra found herself, despite every instinct telling her to remain guarded, looking forward to their arrival more than she wanted to admit. Her replies grew longer with each exchange, though she remained careful never to promise more than honesty and cautious friendship. She told him about difficult cases at her shop, about Mira's failing health that worried her more than she let on in her letters, about the strange comfort of finally speaking to someone who understood the particular weight of pack politics and healer's duties both. Months passed this way, the correspondence becoming a steady thread, connecting two lives that remained otherwise separate. Lyra told herself, repeatedly, that this arrangement suited her perfectly. Distance protected her heart, while still allowing something resembling connection to exist between them. She did not examine too closely why the arrangement sometimes left her feeling unsettled in ways she could not fully name. Then, nearly 4 months after her departure from Blackthorn, the letters stopped. Lyra told herself it meant nothing at first. Pack business could easily explain a gap of a few weeks. But when a full month passed without a single word, worry began gnawing at the edges of her carefully maintained composure. It was Finn, the young warrior who had first brought her evidence against Seraphine, who finally arrived at her shop door one evening, his face grim and his clothes travel-worn from an urgent journey. "Healer Ashwood," he said, bowing quickly despite his obvious exhaustion. "Forgive my intrusion. I bring urgent news from Blackthorn." Lyra's stomach dropped immediately. "What has happened?" "The Northern Coalition," Finn said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. The rival packs that have long threatened our borders finally moved against us 3 weeks ago. They struck the northern outposts first, then pushed deeper into our territory. Alpha Vane has been leading the defense personally, refusing to fall back even as our numbers dwindled. Is he hurt? Lyra asked immediately, her healer instincts, and something far more personal, both flaring to sharp, urgent attention. Finn hesitated, and that hesitation told Lyra everything she needed to know before he even spoke the words. He was wounded 3 days ago, badly. Our healers have done what they can, but the wound will not close properly, and infection has set in. Halden sent me specifically to find you. He said if anyone could save the Alpha, it would be you. Lyra did not hesitate for even a moment. She was already moving, gathering her most essential medical supplies, her mind racing through every possible treatment for battle wounds gone septic, even as her heart pounded with a fear that went far beyond professional concern. Get me a fast carriage, she said. We leave within the hour. The journey back to Blackthorn felt endless, every mile stretching Lyra's nerves tighter than the last. Finn filled her in on the details of the Coalition's attack during the long hours of travel, explaining how 3 rival packs to the north had finally united their forces, using the recent scandal and instability from Seraphine's exile as evidence that Blackthorn had grown weak and vulnerable to conquest. Kalen had fought fiercely to defend his territory, Finn explained, personally leading warriors into battle against overwhelming numbers, refusing to retreat even when logic suggested he should. It was during one such battle, defending the eastern ridge that guarded the pack's primary water source, that he had taken a deep wound to his side from an enemy warrior's claws, a wound that should have healed within days for an alpha of his strength, but instead had turned dark and dangerous with infection. He kept fighting even after he was wounded, Finn said quietly. Wouldn't let anyone pull him from the front lines until the Coalition finally retreated 2 days later. By then, the wound had already grown much worse. Lyra's hands clenched in her lap, frustration and fear tangling together in her chest. Stubborn, foolish man, risking his own life through sheer refusal to show weakness in front of his enemies, the very same flaw that had cost them both so much pain 5 years earlier. When the carriage finally arrived at Blackthorn territory, Lyra did not wait for it to fully stop before jumping down and sprinting toward the pack house, her medical bag clutched tight against her chest, ignoring the startled looks of pack members who watched her race past them with single-minded urgency. She found Halden in the infirmary, his weathered face etched with exhausted worry as he monitored Kalen's condition. The Alpha King lay on a cot, pale and feverish, sweat beading across his forehead despite the coolness of the room, a heavily bandaged wound visible along his side where dark red had begun seeping through the fabric. Lyra, Halden said with visible relief, stepping back to allow her immediate access. Thank the ancestors you came quickly. The infection has spread faster than I expected. I fear we are running out of time. Lyra dropped to her knees beside Kalen's cot, her hands already moving with practiced precision as she examined the wound beneath the bandages, her healer's training taking over completely, even as fear for the man before her threatened to overwhelm her focus. The wound was deep, angry red streaks spreading outward from its edges, a clear sign of infection that had progressed dangerously close to entering his bloodstream entirely. If that happened, even an Alpha's enhanced healing abilities would not be enough to save him. I need boiling water, clean cloth, and my full supply kit brought immediately, Lyra ordered, her voice steady and commanding, despite the panic clawing at the edges of her composure. And someone needs to hold him still. This is going to hurt. As pack members scrambled to follow her instructions, Kalen's eyes fluttered open, fever bright and unfocused, finding her face hovering above him through the haze of his illness. Lyra, he murmured, his voice rough and weak in a way she had never heard from him before. You came. Of course I came, she said, her voice softer than she intended, betraying more emotion than she meant to reveal. Now stay still and let me work. I did not travel 3 days just to watch you die from stubbornness. A ghost of a smile flickered across his fevered face before pain overtook him again, and Lyra turned her full attention to the desperate work of saving his life, her hands steady even as her heart pounded with a fear that had nothing to do with professional concern, and everything to do with the terrifying realization of exactly how much this man's survival mattered to her, whether she was ready to admit it or not. The next several hours blurred together in a haze of intense focus. Lyra cleaned the wound thoroughly, draining infected fluid, applying carefully measured herbal treatments, designed to fight the specific bacteria she identified beneath her makeshift microscope lens. She worked with a precision born from years of experience, but also with an urgency that came from somewhere far more personal than professional duty. Kaylin drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the procedure, sometimes murmuring incoherent words, sometimes gripping her hand with surprising strength during particularly painful moments of treatment. Lyra did not pull away from his grip, telling herself it was simply necessary to keep him calm and still, though some part of her recognized the lie even as she told it to herself. By the time the sun began rising over Blackthorn territory, Lyra finally allowed herself to lean back, exhausted but cautiously hopeful. The infection had been cleaned thoroughly, new treatments applied, and Kaylin's fever, while still present, had begun to show signs of breaking. "He will live," she told Halden quietly, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The next day will tell us how fully he recovers, but I believe the worst danger has passed." Halden nodded gratefully, relief evident across his tired features. "The pack owes you a debt that cannot be measured, healer. Twice now you have saved our Alpha, and countless warriors alongside him." Lyra said nothing in response, simply staring down at Kaylin's sleeping face, finally peaceful now that the fever had begun to loosen its grip. She reached out, almost without meaning to, and brushed a strand of damp hair away from his forehead, the gesture far more intimate than anything a simple healer would offer a patient. She caught herself and pulled her hand back quickly, disturbed by how naturally the gesture had come, by how much fear she had felt watching him suffer, by how completely her careful walls of protection had crumbled the moment she learned his life was in danger. Whatever careful distance she had maintained through months of measured letters and cautious correspondence, it had shattered entirely the instant she learned Kaylin Vane might die. She was not ready to examine what that truth meant for the future she had so carefully built for herself, separate and safe from the pain he had once caused her. But sitting there in the quiet dawn light, watching him breathe steadily for the first time in hours, Lyra could no longer pretend that her feelings toward this man remained as simple, or as resolved, as she had spent 5 years convincing herself they were. Kaylin's recovery progressed steadily over the following days, his strength slowly returning as the infection that had nearly claimed his life continued to fade under Lyra's careful treatment. Color returned to his face, the feverish haze cleared from his eyes, and by the 4th day, he was strong enough to sit up and hold short conversations without exhausting himself completely. Lyra told herself she remained at Blackthorn purely to ensure his full recovery, the same professional justification she had used during her first visit months earlier. But the lie grew harder to maintain with each passing day, especially during the quiet hours she spent beside his cot, changing bandages, monitoring his progress, and finding herself drawn into conversations that stretched far longer than medical necessity required. "You saved my life," Kaylin said one afternoon, watching her carefully as she checked the healing wound along his side. "Again, I am beginning to lose count of how many times I owe you everything." "You should be more careful," Lyra replied, keeping her tone light despite the seriousness underlying her words. "An alpha who dies from stubbornness is not much use to his pack." "I have never been particularly good at knowing when to retreat," Kaylin admitted, a rueful smile touching his lips. "Though I am working on learning that lesson, in more ways than one." Lyra caught the deeper meaning beneath his words, and chose not to respond directly, focusing instead on securing the fresh bandage around his healing wound. But she could feel his eyes on her throughout the task, warm and watchful in a way that made her pulse quicken, despite her best efforts to remain composed. Word of the coalition's retreat had spread through the pack with relief, though Lyra learned from Halden that the victory had come at significant cost. Several warriors had died defending the eastern ridge, and the northern packs, while pushed back for now, remained a persistent threat along Blackthorn's borders. The pack's stability, so recently shaken by Seraphine's scandal and exile, now faced the additional strain of rebuilding its defenses and reassuring nervous pack members that Blackthorn remained strong enough to protect them. It was this exact concern that Lyra overheard being discussed one evening as she passed by the council chamber on her way back from checking on Kaelin's recovery. The Alpha needs a strong mate, Elder Corwin's voice carried clearly through the partially open door. The Coalition attacked specifically because they sensed weakness after the scandal with Seraphine. We cannot afford further instability. A new alliance, properly negotiated this time, would send a clear message of Blackthorn's continued strength. The healer has proven her value to this pack twice over, another elder's voice responded, though with clear hesitation. But she carries no political standing, no connections that would strengthen our position against the Coalition. Sentiment is not enough to secure our borders, however much the Alpha may care for her. Lyra froze in the corridor, her chest tightening painfully, as the familiar, dreaded conversation unfolded on the other side of the door, an echo of the exact discussion that had led to her rejection 5 years earlier. The Alpha has not yet indicated his intentions regarding the healer, Corwin continued, but we must prepare alternative options regardless. House Ravenswood has expressed continued interest in an alliance. Their daughter would bring considerable military strength to our borders, exactly what we need given recent events. Lyra did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked quickly away from the council chamber, her mind spinning with painful familiarity, old wounds reopening with startling speed, despite 5 years of careful healing and months of cautious trust, rebuilt through honest letters. She understood with sudden clarity exactly what was happening. History was repeating itself, the same pressures, the same political calculations, the same elders weighing her worth against strategic alliances and finding her lacking once again. And though Kaelin had not yet made any decision, the very fact that this conversation was happening at all, that the possibility remained on the table despite everything they had rebuilt together, felt like a betrayal all its own. That night, alone in her guest chambers, Lyra made a decision. She would not wait around to discover whether history intended to repeat itself entirely. She would not put herself through the agony of watching Kaelin weigh her worth against political necessity a second time, would not risk her carefully rebuilt heart on the uncertain hope that this time, he might choose differently. She began packing her belongings that same evening, her movements efficient and controlled, though her hands trembled slightly as she worked. She would leave in the morning, before Kaelin was even fully recovered, before any further conversations could complicate the clean, protective distance she desperately needed to re-establish between them. She was nearly finished packing when a soft knock sounded at her door. Lyra opened it to find Kaelin standing in the corridor, still moving carefully due to his healing wound, his expression concerned as he took in the sight of her half-packed belongings scattered across the room behind her. "You're leaving," he said, his voice carrying surprise and something closer to alarm. "Tonight? I thought we agreed you would stay until I was fully recovered." "You're recovering well," Lyra said, keeping her tone carefully neutral. "Halden can manage the remainder of your treatment. I have patients waiting for me in the city, a business that has been neglected for weeks now." Kaelin studied her for a long moment, clearly sensing that something beyond simple professional obligation was driving her sudden urgency to depart. "What happened? Something has changed since this afternoon. Please, tell me what I have done wrong." Lyra hesitated, torn between the instinct to simply leave without explanation and the recognition that after everything they had rebuilt over the past months, he deserved honesty, even if that honesty reopened old wounds neither of them particularly wanted to discuss. "I overheard the elders discussing House Ravenswood," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Discussing the need for a strong political alliance to secure the Pack's borders after the Coalition's attack. It seems some conversations never truly change, regardless of how many years pass between them." Understanding dawned across Kaelin's face, followed swiftly by something that looked almost like panic. "Lyra, that conversation means nothing. The elders discuss potential alliances constantly. It is simply part of their function within the Pack. I have made no decisions, considered no proposals, entertained no possibility of choosing anyone other than—" He stopped himself abruptly, but the unspoken end of his sentence hung heavy in the air between them regardless. "Other than me," Lyra finished quietly. "But that's exactly the problem, Kaelin. 5 years ago, you also had no intention of choosing anyone but me, right up until the moment political pressure convinced you otherwise. I cannot build my future around the hope that this time will be different, simply because you say the words differently than you did back then. I am not the same man I was 5 years ago, Kalen said, desperation creeping into his voice now. I have spent months proving that through every letter, every honest conversation we have shared since you returned. Please, do not let one overheard conversation undo everything we have rebuilt. Lyra felt her resolve wavering slightly under the weight of his obvious sincerity, but she forced herself to remember the fear that had gripped her the moment she heard Elder Corwin's voice discussing alliance marriages, the instant, visceral terror of history repeating itself exactly as it had before. I need time, she said finally. Away from here, away from this pack's politics and pressures. I need to think clearly about what I actually want, without the constant reminder of everything that could go wrong hanging over every conversation we share. Kalen's shoulders sagged slightly, disappointment evident despite his obvious effort to remain understanding. I will not stop you from leaving, but please, Lyra, before you go, know this. Whatever the elders discuss, whatever political pressures exist, I have already made my choice, in every way that matters. I chose wrong once, and I have spent 5 years living with the consequences of that mistake. I will not make the same mistake twice, regardless of what alliances or advantages another choice might offer. Lyra studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of the calculation and fear that had driven his decision 5 years earlier, and found instead only steady, unwavering sincerity. But sincerity, she reminded herself firmly, had not been the deciding factor 5 years ago either. Pressure, fear, and political necessity had overridden whatever sincere feelings he might have carried that night, and she could not simply trust that circumstances would play out differently this time, no matter how much she wanted to believe otherwise. I will write to you, she said finally, once I have had time to think clearly. But I need this distance, Kalen. I need to know that whatever decision I ultimately make comes from genuine clarity, not simply from being caught up in the intensity of nearly losing you to infection and old fears resurfacing all at once. Kalen nodded slowly, accepting her decision even as clear pain lingered in his expression. I understand. Travel safely, Lyra, and please, know that whatever you decide, I will respect it, even if it breaks whatever remains of my heart to do so. Lyra left Blackthorn territory the following morning, her carriage rolling away from the Packlands for the second time in her life, though this departure felt entirely different from the first. This time, she left not from rejection, but from her own careful choice to protect herself from a pain she feared repeating. As the pack house disappeared behind the trees, Lyra found herself uncertain, for the first time in months, about what she truly wanted her future to hold, and whether the careful, protected life she had built for herself was truly the freedom she had once believed it to be, or simply another kind of prison, built from fear rather than genuine peace. 3 weeks passed after Lyra's return to the city, 3 weeks during which she threw herself into her work with an intensity that left little room for the constant churn of thoughts about Blackthorn, about Kalen, about the uncertain future she had left dangling behind her. Her shop remained busy, patients arriving daily with the usual assortment of illnesses and injuries that formed the steady rhythm of her professional life. She found comfort in the familiar routine, in the predictable satisfaction of diagnosing an ailment and providing effective treatment, in the simple clarity that her medical work always seemed to offer, so different from the complicated tangle of emotions that thoughts of Kalen continued to stir within her, despite her best efforts to set them aside. She had written to him only once since her departure, a brief letter explaining that she needed continued time to think, that she was well, and her patients were thriving, careful words that revealed little of the genuine turmoil still churning beneath her composed exterior. Mira, now quite elderly but still sharp-minded, watched her former apprentice with knowing eyes during her regular visits to the shop, saying little, but clearly seeing far more than Lyra wished to reveal. You are unsettled, Mira observed one afternoon, watching Lyra grind herbs with more force than the task actually required. Something continues to weigh on you, child, despite your efforts to hide it behind busy hands and forced composure. I am simply focused on my work, Lyra replied, not quite meeting her old mentor's perceptive gaze. Mira hummed skeptically. settling into her usual chair near the shop's window. Focused work rarely requires quite so much unnecessary force against defenseless herbs. Tell me what troubles you, or continue pretending nothing does. Either way, I suspect the truth will surface eventually. Lyra set down her mortar and pestle with a sigh, finally allowing some of her carefully maintained composure to slip. I don't know what I want anymore, Mira. I thought I had built a life that made me happy, complete, independent of anyone else's approval or presence. And then Blackthorn pulled me back. Twice now, and each time I left again, I found myself less certain of what I actually want than I was before. Perhaps, Mira said gently, the question is not what you want, but what you fear. Sometimes those two things masquerade as the same feeling, when in truth they are quite different. Lyra considered her mentor's words carefully, turning them over in her mind throughout the remainder of the day, long after Mira had departed and the shop had grown quiet with evening's approach. What did she actually want, separate from the fear that had driven her sudden departure from Blackthorn, separate from the old wound of rejection that colored every interaction with Kalen, no matter how much time passed or how genuinely he seemed to have changed? She was still turning these questions over in her mind 3 days later, when the shop bell rang unexpectedly, and she looked up to find Kalen standing in her doorway, travel-worn and clearly exhausted from a hard journey, but very much alive and recovered from the wound that had nearly claimed his life weeks earlier. "Kalen?" she said, startled, setting down the tincture she had been preparing. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said simply, stepping fully into the shop and closing the door behind him. "I could not wait any longer for a letter that might never come, not while so much remained unresolved between us." Lyra crossed her arms protectively, though her heart had already begun pounding at his unexpected presence. "I told you I needed time." "You did," Kalen agreed, "and I have tried to respect that. But 3 weeks of silence, broken only by a single brief letter, taught me something important, Lyra. I cannot simply wait passively while you decide my fate from a distance. If I truly want to prove I have changed, I need to act like it, not simply write careful words and hope they are enough." "What does that mean?" Lyra asked warily, though something in his tone had already begun to shift her careful defenses. "It means I rejected House Ravenswood's proposal formally, before the entire Pack Council, 3 days after you left Blackthorn," Kalen said. "It means I told the elders, in no uncertain terms, that I will not consider any political alliance marriage, now or in the future, regardless of the pressures we face from the Northern Coalition. It means I have spent every day since proving to my pack, through action rather than empty promises, that Blackthorn's strength does not depend on strategic marriages, but on the genuine loyalty of warriors, who trust their alpha to lead with integrity rather than fear." Lyra stared at him, stunned by the weight of what he was describing, by the clear risk he had taken in rejecting political security for the sake of a possibility that remained, even now, deeply uncertain. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly, "without even knowing if I would choose you in return?" "Because it was the right choice, regardless of your answer," Kalen said, taking a careful step closer. "Because 5 years ago, I let fear and political calculation override what I knew, deep in my heart, was the truth. I will not make that mistake again, whether or not you ultimately choose to forgive me, whether or not you choose to build any kind of future with me at all." He closed the remaining distance between them, and Lyra found herself unable to step back, caught by the raw sincerity in his golden eyes, by the visible exhaustion and determination etched across his features after what had clearly been a difficult, hurried journey. "Please," Kalen said, his voice dropping lower, rougher with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Please, don't let me go, Lyra. I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know I broke something between us that may never fully heal, no matter how much time passes, or how thoroughly I prove I have changed. But I love you. I have loved you since that night 5 years ago, through every moment I spent married to someone else, through every year I spent watching you build a life without me, through every letter and every visit that reminded me exactly what I threw away out of fear. Please, give me the chance to spend the rest of my life proving that love, rather than losing you again to a mistake I have already spent 5 years regretting." The shop fell silent, the only sound the quiet crackling of the evening fire, and the distant murmur of the city beyond the walls. Lyra stood very still, absorbing the full weight of his confession, feeling the old familiar pull of the bond that had never fully faded, despite years of distance and careful protection. But as she searched her own heart, truly searched it, for the answer he was so desperately seeking, she found something unexpected waiting there, instead of the overwhelming love she might once have expected to feel. She found peace. She found clarity. And she found, with sudden, undeniable certainty, the truth she had perhaps been avoiding since the moment she first returned to Blackthorn territory months ago. "Kaelin," she said softly, and something in her tone made his expression shift, hope beginning to dim into uncertain worry, even before she continued speaking. "I have spent a long time thinking about exactly this moment, wondering what I would feel if you ever stood before me and said those words, and I think, somewhere along the way, without fully realizing it was happening, I found my answer." "What answer?" Kaelin asked quietly, though something in his voice suggested he already sensed what was coming. "I don't love you anymore," Lyra said, and though the words came out gently, they carried the undeniable weight of complete honesty. "Not in the way I did that night beneath the full moon, not in the desperate, aching way that consumed me during those first painful months after you rejected me. I spent 5 years healing from that pain, Kaelin, 5 years building a life, a purpose, a sense of self-worth that exists completely independent of you. And somewhere in that process, whatever I once felt for you, transformed into something else entirely. Not hatred, not even lingering resentment, not anymore. Simply peace, simply distance. The kind of feeling you have for someone who once mattered enormously, but no longer holds the power to define your happiness." Kaelin's face had gone pale, the hope that had carried him across the long journey to her door crumbling visibly before her eyes. "I don't understand. The bond, the connection we still felt, even during my recovery. The bond exists," Lyra acknowledged softly. "I won't pretend otherwise. Some pull between fated mates never fully disappears, regardless of rejection or distance or time. But a bond is not the same thing as love, Kaelin, and I think, if I am honest with both of us, what I feel now is gratitude for the peace I have built, and genuine happiness that you have found the strength to change, to grow into a better version of the man you once were. But that growth came too late for what we might have had. I already grieved that loss, years ago, and I already rebuilt myself into someone whole without you. I cannot simply set that wholeness aside now, just because you have finally arrived at the place I needed you to be 5 years too late." Tears gathered in Kaelin's eyes, though he made no move to hide them, simply standing before her with the raw vulnerability of a man confronting the complete collapse of every hope he had carried across a difficult journey. "So this is truly over," he said quietly, "whatever chance we might have had." "I think," Lyra said gently, "that some chances only exist within a specific window of time, and once that window closes, no amount of love, or effort, or genuine change can fully reopen it. I am not saying this to hurt you, Kaelin. I am saying it because it is the truth, and you deserve the truth from me, exactly as I deserved it from you 5 years ago." Kaelin nodded slowly, absorbing her words with visible pain, though also, Lyra noticed, with a kind of quiet acceptance that suggested some part of him had perhaps expected exactly this outcome, even as he hoped desperately for a different one. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rough but steady, "for your honesty, and for everything you have given my pack, given me, even after everything I put you through. I will carry the lesson of what I lost for the rest of my life, and I will try to become an alpha worthy of the sacrifice your honesty and your healing hands have made possible." "You already are," Lyra said softly. "The man standing before me now, willing to hear painful truth without demanding I soften it, willing to reject political security for the sake of doing what is right, that man is already worthy, Kaelin. He simply arrived a little too late for the future we might have built together." They stood together in the quiet shop for a while longer, the conversation gradually shifting from heartbreak toward something gentler, something that felt, surprisingly, like the beginning of genuine friendship built on honesty, rather than desperate hope or lingering resentment. When Kaelin finally departed the following morning, beginning the long journey back toward Blackthorn territory, and the pack that needed his leadership. Lyra watched him go, with an ache in her chest that was real, but no longer sharp, no longer defining, simply the quiet sadness of a chapter closing gently, rather than being torn away violently, as it once had been. She had told him the truth. She had stopped loving him, somewhere in the quiet years of rebuilding herself, though she had not fully understood that truth until the exact moment he stood before her, offering everything she had once desperately wanted, arriving finally at the place she needed him to be, but arriving too late to reclaim a heart that had already, carefully and completely, learned to belong entirely to itself. Spring arrived in the city with its usual gentle warmth, sunlight filtering through the windows of Lyra's shop as she arranged fresh herbs along her shelves, humming quietly to herself as she worked. It had been nearly a year since Kaylin's visit, since the conversation that had finally, fully closed the door on a chapter of her life that had once threatened to define everything about her. She thought of him sometimes, though the thoughts no longer carried the sharp ache they once had. She had received occasional letters over the months since his departure, brief updates on pack matters, news of Blackthorn's continued recovery and strengthening defenses against the Northern Coalition, careful words from a man who seemed to have genuinely accepted the boundaries she had drawn, choosing friendship and honesty over lingering hope for something more. She had heard, through one such letter, that Kaylin had begun training a new generation of warriors, with an emphasis on loyalty, built through genuine leadership rather than fear, that Blackthorn's alliances with neighboring packs had grown stronger through honest diplomacy rather than strategic marriages, that the pack itself seemed to be thriving under an alpha who had finally learned the difference between strength and stubbornness, between duty and cowardice, disguised as pragmatism. She was glad for him, genuinely and without complication, the way one might be glad for an old friend who had found their footing after a difficult season of growth. Her own life, meanwhile, had continued to flourish in ways that filled her with quiet, steady contentment. Her shop had grown successful enough that she had recently taken on her own apprentice, a bright young woman named Tessa, who reminded Lyra, in certain unguarded moments, of her own younger self, eager and uncertain, and full of potential, waiting to be discovered. Mira had passed peacefully several months earlier, surrounded by the community of healers she had trained over her long career, and Lyra had taken over full guardianship of the Healers Guild Hall in her mentor's honor, a role that filled her with purpose and connected her to a legacy far larger than any single relationship, past or present, could ever define. It was on a particularly warm afternoon, as Lyra taught Tessa the proper technique for preparing a complex wound salve, that a familiar face appeared at her shop door, though not the one she might once have expected. "Finn," Lyra said, surprised and pleased, setting down her tools to greet the young warrior who had grown considerably since she had last seen him. His shoulders broader now, his bearing more confident with the passage of time and experience. "What brings you to the city?" "I've been promoted," Finn said, a proud smile spreading across his face. "Lead warrior of the Eastern Guard, Alpha Vane sent me to negotiate trade agreements with the city council, and I couldn't pass through without visiting the healer who changed the course of Blackthorn's history." Lyra laughed, genuinely delighted by his obvious happiness and success. "Congratulations, Finn. You certainly earned it, bringing that evidence forward when you could have easily stayed silent and avoided the risk entirely." "I learned that from watching you," Finn said earnestly, "watching someone choose the harder, more honest path, even when silence would have been easier. It changed how I think about courage." They spoke for a while longer, Finn sharing news of Blackthorn's continued growth and stability, of warriors fully recovered from the poisoning years earlier, of a pack that had transformed itself, slowly and steadily, into something stronger and more genuine than it had been before the scandal that once threatened to tear it apart entirely. "And the Alpha?" Lyra asked eventually, curiosity finally overcoming her reluctance to inquire directly. "How does he fare?" Finn considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "He leads well. Better than well, honestly. The pack trusts him completely now, in a way they perhaps never fully did during his marriage to the former alpha female. He hasn't remarried, hasn't even entertained the possibility, despite continued pressure from certain elders, who still believe political alliance is the only path to lasting security." "Why not?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious rather than concerned. "I think," Finn said carefully, "he learned something important about choosing duty over honesty, and he refuses to make that particular mistake again, regardless of what any future alliance might offer. He told me once that some lessons are worth learning, even when they arrive too late to fix what they broke, because the growth itself still matters, for the person he becomes and the leader his pack deserves." Lyra absorbed these words quietly, feeling the truth of them settle into the peaceful place in her heart, where memories of Kaelin now resided, no longer sharp with pain, simply part of the larger story that had shaped who she had become. After Finn departed, continuing his journey toward his trade negotiations, Lyra returned to her afternoon lesson with Tessa, guiding her young apprentice through the careful preparation of the wound salve with patient, practiced instruction. As evening approached and Tessa finally departed for the day, Lyra found herself alone in her quiet shop, surrounded by the herbs and remedies that had become the foundation of a life built entirely on her own terms, a life that no longer required anyone else's approval or presence to feel complete. She thought of the frightened girl who had once fled Blackthorn territory with nothing but a single pack and a broken heart, and she felt a deep, quiet gratitude for everything that difficult journey had ultimately taught her. She thought of the woman she had become since, strong and skilled and entirely secure in her own worth, no longer needing a bond or a title or anyone's rejection or acceptance to define who she truly was. She thought, too, of Kaelin, and found she could hold the memory gently now, without bitterness, without lingering ache, simply as an important chapter in a story that had ultimately led her exactly where she needed to be. Perhaps, she thought, closing up her shop for the evening and stepping out into the warm spring air, that was the truest kind of freedom after all. Not the absence of pain or difficult history, but the ability to look back at both with clear eyes and genuine peace, carrying forward only the wisdom those experiences had offered, while leaving behind whatever weight no longer served the life she had chosen to build. She walked home beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars, her steps light, her heart settled, fully and completely her own. Whatever the future held, Lyra Ashwood knew, with quiet and unshakable certainty, that she would meet it exactly as she was, whole and strong and free, needing nothing more than the life she had built with her own two capable hands. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, that certainty was more than enough.